I propose to take questions 6 to 9 together. The remit of Cabinet Committee C covers EU and international issues, including Brexit, and assists my participation as a member of the European Council. It last met on Thursday, the 21st of June 2018, in advance of the European Council on the 28th and 29th of June. It was the third such meeting of the next Cabinet Committee. The next meeting has not yet been scheduled. Cabinet committees are often used to prepare topics for discussion ahead of consideration by full Cabinet. But given the significance of Brexit for the country, we've discussed it at full Cabinet level several times in recent months, as was the case most recently on the 15th of January, and again on the 22nd of January, and again indeed yesterday. I think it's important that all Cabinet Ministers should be fully across what's happening in relation to Brexit. Several other important EU issues have also been discussed at full Cabinet level in recent months. I also regularly meet with individual ministers or groups of relevant ministers to focus on particular issues, including those related to Brexit and other EU and international issues, with a view to seeing how government can best assist the delivery of priorities and commitments.
That the Cabinet Subcommittee basically is redundant in terms of Brexit, and that that's for another day. I think, as you said earlier, Taoiseach, as things stand, there is deadlock in relation to Brexit. The British House of Commons has voted in favour of Brexit, against the draft withdrawal agreement, in favour of having a deal, and against the proposed backstop. Obviously, as you just articulated, you're going to simply keep repeating the deal is closed. So can you be clear with the House for a moment? Are you saying today, Taoiseach, and is that what you were saying earlier, that unless the British Parliament changes its position, there will be no deal Brexit on March the 29th? Is that what you're essentially saying? Unless the British Parliament changes its position, the government, there will be a no-deal Brexit on March the 29th. Because over recent weeks we've had entirely contradictory statements from government on important matters. You may recall the Taoiseach went as far as to tell Minister Ross to shut up when he said there might be security measures at the border. Yet a few days later you said not just exactly the same thing, but you said much, much more in terms of what would happen at the border in a no-deal scenario. And you've also said that yourself and the Taoiseach said that you're not contemplating a hard border, and that a hard border is inevitable. You said both things. 2 months before Brexit, we have no legislation actually before the House. The majority of businesses are not Brexit ready, and the Central Bank is warning of a more dramatic impact this year than the government's official projection. So can you be clear and explain exactly what security or other measures are likely in March if there is no deal? I think enough time has been wasted in telling us what isn't being contemplated 7 months after you first announced the acceleration of no-deal preparations and 58 days before a possible hard Brexit. What will happen on the border unless the deal is ratified in London?
Burton.
Thank you. I understand you say that the Cabinet Committee C on the European Union hasn't met since June. But Cabinet subcommittees have a purpose. I know you've indicated to us before that you're not too fond of them. But they allow, for instance, very senior civil servants to come in and to brief in detail in relation to the details of papers. For example, to actually set out how they imagine in detail the backstop would work and what considerations, planning, who they may have discussed and talked with. That kind of information is not normally at a full Cabinet meeting, nor are people other than members of the Cabinet and the Secretary to the Government and the Attorney-General normally present at Cabinet. Now, are you saying that you, in fact, are bringing some of these people who have an enormous skill set from the Department of Foreign Affairs, from your own department, in to brief the wider Cabinet? Or is it you who's doing all this briefing? I am not surprised now that Shane Ross was very surprised, because clearly, as, if you like, the leader of the minor party in the government, he would need to be kept very briefed and possibly have access to something like a Cabinet subcommittee to be aware that there were going to be issues or not going to be issues and how they were likely to pan out at the border. So I haven't heard that the Cabinet has gone on extraordinarily long. So if you're having Cabinet subcommittees at Cabinet meetings, we should be reading that you're kind of coming out grey and exhausted 10 hours later because you're piling them on. I think we deserve to know a little bit more about how the members of the Cabinet are briefed, and the subcommittee and the minor party, because this is a very big issue for Ireland, and we want those people who are representing us to do so to the best of their ability. Have you spoken since the votes last night with any of the leaders in the European Union, the President of the Commission, the President of the Council? And when do you anticipate, are you going to go on a tour of Europe to meet the leaders to basically discuss the situation posed? Because what you're indicating to us now is a position, if I understand it correctly, that there will be no change. You're not anticipating meeting anyone from Northern Ireland, like the DUP, those who are on the Leave side. And if Theresa May comes to Dublin, is she planning to come to Dublin? You said you spoke to her yesterday. You're going to speak to her again today. Could you tell us something about that?
Deputy McDonald, please.
Thank you, Corla. Taoiseach, I would direct you to hearings of the Justice Committee of this House to familiarise yourself with the extent of the loss of citizens' rights which Brexit will entail. I think you should inform yourself in that regard. It's a matter of astonishment that the turn of events in the House of Commons last evening was being depicted as a great success for Theresa May within sections of the British media. The reality is that Mrs May whipped her own MPs to vote against and to press the destruct button on an agreement which she herself negotiated. The truth is that Theresa May has acted absolutely in bad faith in respect of an agreement that she brokered with the European institutions, and more fundamentally and more importantly for our purposes, it was an act of absolute bad faith in respect of the Good Friday Agreement and the obligations of the British state under international law. I read last evening's turn of events not as some gaffe or something born of ignorance, but this is an act of belligerence by an element of the British political establishment. I regard it as an act of aggression against the Irish people, north and south, and against Irish interests, and it didn't happen by accident. This is a calculated matter that comes from the thinking of the Boris Johnsons and the Jacob Rees-Moggs and all the other extremist Brexiteers, and, let it be said, the DUP. This has to be faced down, Taoiseach. I want to say that it is absolutely essential at this stage that your will is not bent, that you do not blink, that you are not cowed, irrespective of the overtures from London. And to say this finally in terms of contingency planning, the facts are this: if there is a crash and if the extremist Brexiteers have their way, well, then there will be a hard border on our island. There was a demonstration over the weekend, Taoiseach, you may be aware, up on the border, and the communities there have made absolutely clear they will not tolerate any hardening of that border. And so therefore, Taoiseach, part of your contingency planning has to be, in the event of a crash, to reach back to the Good Friday Agreement, who all have vowed to protect and to implement, and to look towards the provision for a referendum. In other words, if the political system cannot deal and resolve the issue of the border, then put that question in the hands of the people by way of a democratic referendum.
Thank you very much, Deputy Haughey.
Ceann Comhairle, I know we're preoccupied with the issue of Brexit in this House, and rightly so I'm reluctant to raise another issue, but I would just like to ask the Taoiseach about the debate on the future of Europe. there's a lot of developments happening with regard to the European Union at the moment. Big issues such as migration, the rise of populism on the far right and the far left, moves towards corporate tax harmonisation, moves towards further integration within the European Union. As you know, your Minister of State, Helen McEntee, engaged in a public consultation process in relation to the future of Europe and produced the report on the citizens' dialogues on the future of Europe. That report concludes with reference to the summit to take place in Sibiu in Romania on the 9th of May, an informal summit. And the report states that in advance of this summit, we will publish a statement on our strategic priorities for the European Union, capturing the ideas which were put forward during the consultation process to set out Ireland's vision for the coming years. Taoiseach, can we get some indication of how you intend to approach that summit? I know there's plenty of time in advance of that European summit, but I'd be interested to know your thinking at this stage and the Irish stance, and if you would keep the House fully informed of this particular debate, because the future of Europe obviously is of consequences to us all.
And Taoiseach, can quite return to the Brexit issue. Could I encourage the Taoiseach to continue to brief the leaders of the opposition, to convene again as appropriate, either later this week or early next week, the sort of meeting you had last week, to allow us to discuss in private what the latest developments are, because I think it's important we do retain a cohesion and consensus as best we can. I think we need to be careful with our language. We need not to inflame it or to be antagonistic towards the UK political system that's in a real mess on this. But I think we also need to keep very close to our European colleagues. I hope to have our own leader of the European Green Party, one of the co-leaders in Dublin next week, and I think that will help us to brief each other on what the approach is. And I would imagine each party grouping here will do the same with the European colleagues. It would help, Taoiseach, if you could share any sense in that regard as to, as Deputy Burton asked earlier on, what is your sense of what the communications or the approach will be from the European institutions, either the negotiation team, the Council President or Commission President? Have they given any indication to you as to what their approach is in the coming 2 weeks in response to the votes in the House of Commons yesterday?
You're right. Now the questions have gone way over time. Maybe Taoiseach, would 5 minutes be adequate to respond?
I agree with deputies that cabinet committees serve a purpose, but my preference, as much as possible, is to use the cabinet itself to discuss matters of major importance. And meetings are longer than they would have been in the past and are more frequent. We quite regularly have 2 in a week, and that allows us to be focused and not to have to come out tired and looking grey, which I can assure Deputy Burton will never happen. In terms of briefings, cabinet briefings, they're done by me or by the Taoiseach, or in some cases, depending on the issue, by other ministers or the Secretary General to the Government. But there are other briefings. So ministers will regularly receive briefings from officials in the EU section in my department. Sometimes we'll do that in the Sycamore room. But it is exactly that. It's a briefing. It's not a meeting of a cabinet subcommittee, which requires a senior officials group before it, agendas, lots of other things. Briefings are a much more straightforward affair than a cabinet subcommittee is. In terms of the position of the British Parliament, I heard how Deputy Martin describes it. It's not really for me to interpret the will of the House of Commons, but as I understand it, their position is that there should not be a no-deal exit on the 29th of March, and that is the Spellman Amendment passed last night. But it is up to them, obviously, to realise that, should they choose to do so. And in relation to a no-deal exit, the truth is nobody knows for sure what would happen in the event of no deal. It is uncharted territory. But what we can do, what we can do is prepare for different scenarios and eventualities, and that's exactly what we're doing. In terms of speaking to other EU heads of state and heads of government, I spoke to about 7 in person last week in Davos, anticipating the events, and we're all ad idem that the withdrawal agreement is not up for renegotiation and can't be reopened. I've also spoke obviously by phone with President Juncker as well from Davos on Thursday. And I'll probably travel to Brussels next week, but that will depend on other business and the availability of other people as well as myself. And we have the EU Arab League summit coming up as well in a few weeks' time, which will be another opportunity to meet people in person. There aren't any proposals at the moment for Prime Minister May to visit Dublin. There was a proposal that she would do so back in November or December, but couldn't make it on the day because there was a confidence motion put down on her by some of her own party members. In terms of meeting the party leaders again, I absolutely intend to do that. Best done when there's something new to say or to talk about, but perhaps that'll be next week. And I do think it is right and important that party leaders should be able to meet in private and in lodge. So I hope that'll be possible. On Mrs Foster, we reached out to each other actually last week by phone, and there are efforts underway to convene a meeting involving the Irish Government and the DUP. But I think it is important to always remember that these negotiations are between the EU and Ireland, or the EU including Ireland on the one hand, and the United Kingdom on the other. We're not negotiating or even approaching any type of negotiation with any political party. And there are lots of political parties in Northern Ireland. And when we listen to the voice of Northern Ireland, I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking that that's the voice of only one party. There are many other parties in Northern Ireland. And of course there is the voice of Northern Ireland, which includes people who are not members of political parties, business groups, the Ulster Farmers Union, many others with whom the government has a very regular engagement. And there is of course regular informal engagement with the UP MPs and MLAs as ministers visit Northern Ireland and in London as well.